So last week, I began in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a service which I thought was going to be one service entitled The Three Dimensions of a Complete Life, which was a sermon that Martin Luther King Jr. first delivered on January 24th, 1954, at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. But there's so much richness in it. I thought, okay, well, it'll be two, and then now it's three. So the sermon entitled The Three Dimensions of a Rich Life, although it was first given in Montgomery, Alabama in 1954, Martin Luther King Jr. went on to deliver that same sermon numerous times at different Baptist church and in other venues where he gave speeches, because there was richness in inspiring people what they are needing to embody in order to birth what he calls the New Jerusalem, which is mentioned, where he got that inspiration for the talk was from, yes, the teachings of Jesus, but also he drew that inspiration from the book of Revelations, which I shared with you last week. Now, the book of Revelations is credited with being, John of Patmos was credited with being the author of the book of Revelations. And so last week I said that John, the apostle, was the author. And so Lawrence came to me and says, no, he's not the John. So I'm like, oh, my resources say this, and I'm open, right? So I do some research, and there is like a debate. So some people believe that John of Patmos is the Apostle John, and others believe it is John the Elder, who is later one of the earlier teachers of Christianity. However, what I would like to, it's important, but what King really put his focus on was the historical parallels to what was going on in the civil rights movement and what was going on with him and African American individuals, marginalized individuals, and also the rich symbolism that was contained in the book of Revelation. So in particular, what he spoke of was in the book of Revelations, chapter 21, verse 16, where it reads this: "The city has 4 equal sides, its length the same as its width, and he measured the city with a rod, 12,000 stadia, and its length and width, also known as breadth and height, are equal." And so last week I really delved into a lot of the symbolism, metaphysics of the numbers and stuff. So I'm just going to do a quick review for those who were not here. And so before I go there, the historic parallel for him, or what was going on for John, who was imprisoned in the island of Patmos for teaching Christianity, the teachings of Christianity early on, was blasphemy. It was against Jewish law. And so he was exiled to the island, and many of his rights, his freedoms, were stripped. And to be, in prison is got to be, I can't imagine, very challenging, very lonely, where you probably, you have to go really deep within, right? To find, to have that communion as you are in the midst of this physical challenge and darkness. And so King can relate. During the civil rights movement, he too was imprisoned, right? For leading nonviolent sit-ins, boycotts, et cetera, for preaching, for organizing the African American and marginalized people and other people to stand for what was right and just. And it is also the parallel to what the African Americans and marginalized people were experiencing. They too had many rights and freedoms stripped of them, but he wanted them to know that they may treat you this way. You may have many rights stripped from you, but no one or no thing can take away your freedom to think, what you will hold in consciousness. No one can ever take away your freedom to pray, to meditate, and no one can take away your power of faith. And so our power of faith is, every one of our spiritual powers is always active. The question becomes, what are we placing our faith, our belief, our assurance in? And sometimes the appearances are so bleak and dark. But despite the appearances, many of the masters and heroes, be it Jesus or Martin Luther King Jr. or John of Patmos, right, were able to place their faith and their consciousness in spiritual truth and to see that there's a possibility to birth something anew, which is the New Jerusalem. And that has many parallels and symbolism, meaning not only Jerusalem means in the Greek etymology, it means the habitation of peace. And in metaphysics, it means to live in a state where we hold an illuminated spiritual consciousness. And we live in a both end. We have our human rules and laws that sometimes are not grounded in spiritual truth. They do not afford everybody the dignity and equality. They do not treat people equally under the law in this system of reward and punishment. And so in this sermon, he was trying to, inspire people to stand, to hold a new vision. And so we see that 3 ways that they can birth this new nation, this in consciousness and in truth, where all people can be treated equally, was to embody the 3 dimensions of life. And that is the dimension of length, the dimension of breadth, and the dimension of height. So last week we went over what the dimension of length was, and that is the inner focus, right? We're supposed to be, it's not like we're supposed to be balancing, using our power of order in harmonizing all of these in our lives, right? And sometimes it's a little hard. We may just focus on one, and we'll talk about that later. And so the length of life is that inward focus where we are called to love ourselves, to have dignity for who we are. And in speaking to the African American population, after many years of trauma, generations of slavery and being spat on and hung and tarred and feathered, there is this trauma, but also this insidious belief that maybe I'm holding that I am less than. And so it was to call to them and say, no, you are worth something. And he called them to say, I am black and I am beautiful. And to know that with every fiber of their being. And then also to look at what is it that I am called? What are my God-given gifts? The gift of compassion, the gift of mercy, the gift of music, whatever it may be, and to really take time to hone that. And then we move into, it's not enough, he says, don't stop there. You must embody now, step into the dimension of the breadth of life. And that is now where we become outward focused. That is where we become concerned for the welfare of others. And Martin Luther King says this, a man and a woman has not begun to live until he or she can rise above the narrow confines of his own individual concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. So how are we to do this? And we know that Martin Luther King Day is also not only the day where we, honor him and his legacy and his teachings and how many ways he's changed and how do we live that forward, but he was also very much about modeling service to others, right? It's a day of service. But we are to carry that forward in our lives on a regular basis. How do we use our gifts in service of another? And he says, a lot of times we can be so bogged down with so many responsibilities that, we stop there. We don't have time for other things. We don't have time for other people. And sometimes there is this mindset, especially, unfortunately, where are the leaders of our nations forget why they are there. That they are here to serve the people, not to line their pockets, right? Not to divide. And this is what we're experiencing many times throughout history, but now we are being called to look at that, like more so, right? Instead of looking at, oh, I'm going to befriend you or have you in my administration because you're going to make me rich, or you're going to do X, Y, or Z for me. It's like, how do we become the humble servant? And so he shares in there that we can model how to be a good neighbor by following the teaching of Jesus as taught in one of Jesus's famous parable, one of his most famous parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so the parable of the Good Samaritan starts out like this, where there's a man of the law, a lawyer, right? He was trying to test Jesus because, Jesus's teachings were so profound and they threatened the Jewish, meritocracy system of morality, and it was grounded in rules and religious dogma. And Jesus comes along and he's like, I'm not about the letter of the law, I'm about the spirit of the law. I don't just love you on a Monday. I can love you on Sunday when the religious law says I'm not supposed to love you or to do work, right? It's crazy, it's blasphemy stuff. So here Jesus comes. So there were many people who are like, oh, who is this man teaching these radical things, right? And so a lawyer asked him, so what must one do to inherit eternal life? And so Jesus was not only a famous healer, powerful healer, but he was a powerful teacher. And so he would turn things on and he would ask them, it's not just about what I think. I want to know, what do you think? And so the lawyer responds by sharing from Luke 10:27. Oh, to inherit eternal life means we must love the Lord our God with all our hearts, our souls, our strength, and with all our minds, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus is like, yes, that's right. And then he's like, all right. The lawyer says, all right, so who's my neighbor? Right? And so now Jesus responds with the parable. So Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and took off, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came upon him, and when he saw him, he was moved with compassion. He went to him, and he bandaged his wounds, treating them with oil and wine. And then he put him on his animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" The lawyer said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." So I want to go over some of the metaphysical teachings and the symbolism that Martin Luther King shared with in the sermon, The 3 Dimensions of a Complete Life. So he says, so first off, the priest and the Levite were both Jewish leaders of the day. All right, the priest was the one who did ceremonial ceremonies and rites and sacraments and all that. Well, they weren't called sacraments in the temple, and the Levite was the one who assisted. And so there's this historical context where, number one, it was unclean to touch a human body or blood 24 hours before you were to deliver, to preside over any ceremonies in this temple. And then he said, King gives this other reason, and he says, and also they were too busy, it's like, I got to get to temple. I don't have time to stop, I got to get there. And so he gives another one, and he says, I believe not only was it that going on, but he believes it was fear. Fear. What will happen to me, and I'll go into that more, right, if I stop? Fear, the Jewish law is, a Samaritan was someone who was unclean, less than. What will somebody, will I get kicked out of the church? The temple? Will I be stripped of my rights? So on and so on. And so let's look at what does it mean to go down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So I already shared with you that Jerusalem metaphysically means that state of consciousness, the higher state of consciousness, the Christ consciousness, the Buddha consciousness, illuminated spiritual consciousness. Jericho is that place in our consciousness when fear takes over like a robber. Those are our robbers of our consciousness, right? Then fear takes over and we slip back into our human ego. Every man and woman for himself, right? I can't hold the vision of healing because of all these symptoms, right? Those fears that rob us in our consciousness. And so that fear, right, is something that we sometimes, how many of you can relate, just in simple terms, never mind living in times where you're standing for those who are considered unclean, which in the civil rights movement was what? African Americans, right? Now, who are those who are unclean? We'll get back to that at the end. So to have that fear, but even on the simple terms, how many of you pray and meditate, right? And then a loved one says something, "Rawr." And we go from Jerusalem to Jericho in consciousness in a heartbeat, right? Could be the driver, could be anyone. And so we're looking at that and being mindful of that. So now I want to spend some time on the Samaritan. And so the Samaritan, like I shared before, during Jesus' day were viewed as outsiders, heretics. Jesus was a heretic. They were viewed as a heretic because he preached the spirit of the law, right, instead of the letter of the law. And which was different. And they believed that they were impure, unclean, because they worshiped and believed differently. And so the Samaritan was the one who demonstrated what it meant to love thy neighbor, how to live centered in the consciousness of oneness rather than from the consciousness of separation, which is rooted in our human laws, grounded in hierarchy, control, and oppression. And when I was talking about step 5 of the 12-step program, when we talk about the system of rewards and punishment, we can see that all over, right? In religion, I have to do certain things, and if I, don't go to confession, and if I don't go to church, and if I don't pay enough money, then I'm not a good Christian. Or if I don't get these grades in school, then I'm not worthy. I don't get to go to college, I'm less than, if so on and so on. And so we allow that thinking to cloud our view, or somebody who's our loved one doesn't do what we want them to do, right? We withhold our love, so to speak. And so we are asked, how can we remain in that consciousness without allowing the fears to rob us, right? Of stepping into that. And so Martin Luther King said that probably the priest and the Levite started out with asking the wrong question first. He believes that they asked because out of fear, that the first question they pondered was, what will happen to me if I stop to help this man? Rather than having the first question be, what will happen to this man if I don't stop to help them? Right? And it could be, like I said, simple in our day, where we get so busy and we don't have time for people, or we get tired. And so I want to go over, what does it mean? We have these two poles. We can say that they're poles. When we say love your neighbor as thyself, in the consciousness of a separation, we're like, I've talked about polarity or power of order, right? Where we can, how do we manage that sometimes? Love of self, that inner nurturance and care that we have, and that love thy neighbor, serving others. And some of us kind of hang out on one pole, right? I'm only going to help those. What are they doing for me? Kind of mentality, right? So I don't, or it could be, I got so much going on in my life, X, Y, or Z. I can't do it. Or we can be stuck on the other pole, the length pole, where we are constantly caretaking, giving, doing for other people, that we're ragged. So how do we do that both in? And I'm not saying that and so what happens sometimes is we go all the way to the ragged stage and like, I don't have time for anything else. So then we're like, I don't have time to be of service or to do, X, Y, or Z. And so what does that look like to be in balance? Now, I'm not saying, 3 weeks I had surgery, all right, I was holding people in prayer, but I had to take a little respite. So I'm not saying that that there are not times where we pull back. But just notice if you're swinging from pole to pole, or if you're kind of like knowing that I'm being called to do a both in that, right? And so I want to begin to close today by asking a couple of questions. Jesus asked a lot of questions, so I can't. So, how could you, first off, be a good neighbor to yourself? Just take a moment. How is that happening for you? How are you doing with being a good neighbor to people in your close circles, your loved ones, close friends? How are you being a good neighbor to people in this community or other communities that you may belong to? How are you being a good neighbor to people in your county, your state, and in this nation? It may be overwhelming to try to see how we can do that. And it doesn't have to be that you're going to be the one who leads the civil rights movement. But what is one thing? And so King shares this. The Good Samaritans today are men and women who will ask, what will happen to humanity if I don't help? What will happen to the civil rights movement if I don't participate? What will happen to my city if I don't vote? What will happen to the sick if I don't visit them? And now I would like to share with you just a small excerpt from the Bishop Marion Edgar Buddy, who spoke after President Trump's inauguration, when many from his administration were sitting in church that morning. And here are some of her words. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. The people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meat packing plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals. They may not be citizens or have the proper documentation, but the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. They pay taxes and are good neighbors. They are faithful members of our churches and mosques, synagogues, and temples. Our way shower Jesus teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger, for we are all have been once strangers in this land. May God grant us the strength and courage to honor the dignity of every human being, to speak the truth to one another in love and walk humbly with each other and our God for the good of all people. The good of all people in this nation. May we all have mercy. And so some would say that I'm speaking, or Marianne Buddy was speaking politics in a religious community. And I would tell you that is the consciousness of separation. You see, I don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or whatever you say you are. We are all equal in the eyes of the divine, which is mystery and sacred worth. Are the gay, lesbian, and immigrants, transgender people, the unclean today? Those who the priest and the Levite would walk past. Would we walk past them? How are we being called in this moment, in this time, to lead from the spiritual consciousness of Jerusalem to birth a new Jerusalem, a nation where all people are created equal, and stop playing political football. Let our spirituality be one that knows how to love thy neighbor. Have a blessed day, a blessed week. Namaste.